Chapter 24. The amphitheater had been designed to hold the entire waking population of Diaspar, and scarcely one of its 10 million places was empty. As he looked down the great curving sweep from his vantage point high up the slope, Alvin was irresistibly reminded of Shalmarain. The two craters were of the same shape, and almost the same size. If one packed the crater of Shalmarain with humanity, it would look very much like this. There was, however, one fundamental difference between the two. The great bowl of Shalmarain existed. This amphitheater did not, nor had it ever done so. It was merely a phantom, a pattern of electronic charges slumbering in the memory of the central computer until the need came to call it forth. Alvin knew that in reality, he was still in his room, and that all the myriads of people who appeared to surround him were equally in their own homes. As long as he made no attempt to move from this spot, the illusion was perfect. He could believe that Diaspar had been abolished, and that all its citizens had been assembled here in this enormous concavity. Not once in 1,000 years did the life of the city stop so that all its people could meet in grand assembly. In Lys also, Alvin knew, the equivalent of this gathering was taking place. There it would be a meeting of minds, but perhaps associated with it would be an apparent meeting of bodies, as imaginary, yet as seemingly real as this. He could recognize most of the faces around him, out to the limits of unaided vision. More than a mile away, and 1,000 feet below, was the little circular stage upon which the attention of the entire world was now fixed. It was hard to believe that he could see anything from such a great distance, but Alvin knew that when the address began, he would hear and observe everything that happened as clearly as anyone else in Diaspar. The stage filled with mist. The mist became Calatrax, leader of the group whose task it had been to reconstruct the past from the information which Vanamonde had brought to Earth. It had been a stupendous, almost an impossible undertaking, and not merely because of the spans of time involved. Only once, with the mental help of Hilvar, had Alvin been given a brief glimpse into the mind of the strange being they had discovered, or who had discovered them. To Alvin, the thoughts of Vanamonde were as meaningless as 1,000 voices shouting together in some vast echoing cave. Yet the men of Lys could disentangle them, could record them to be analyzed at leisure. Already, so it was rumored, though Hilvar would neither deny nor confirm this, what they had discovered was so strange that it bore scarcely any resemblance to the history which all the human race had accepted for 1 billion years. Calatrax began to speak. To Alvin, as to everyone else in Diaspar, the clear, precise voice seemed to come from a point only a few inches away. Then, in a manner that was hard to define, just as the geometry of a dream defies logic, yet rouses no surprise in the mind of the dreamer, Alvin was standing beside Calatrax, while at the same time he retained his position high up on the slopes of the amphitheater. The paradox did not puzzle him. He simply accepted it without question, like all the other masteries over time and space which science had given him. Very briefly, Calatrax ran through the accepted history of the race. He spoke of the unknown peoples of the Dawn civilizations, who had left behind them nothing but a handful of great names, and the fading legends of the Empire. Even at the beginning, so the story went, man had desired the stars, and had at last attained them. For millions of years, he had expanded across the galaxy, gathering system after system beneath his sway. Then, out of the darkness beyond the rim of the universe, the invaders had struck, and wrenched from him all that he had won. The retreat to the solar system had been bitter, and must have lasted many ages. Earth itself was barely saved by the fabulous battles that raged around Shalmarain. When all was said and over, man was left with only his memories and the world on which he had been born. Since then, all else had been long-drawn anticlimax. As an ultimate irony, the race that had hoped to rule the universe had abandoned most of its own tiny world, and had split into the two isolated cultures of Lys and Diaspar. Oases of life in a desert that sundered them as effectively as the gulfs between the stars. Calatrax paused. To Alvin, as to everyone else in the great assembly, it seemed that the historian was looking directly at him with eyes that had witnessed things which even now they could not wholly credit. "So much," said Calatrax, "for the tales we have believed since our records began. I must tell you now that they are false. False in every detail. So false that even now we have not fully reconciled them with the truth." He waited for the full meaning of his words to strike home. Then, speaking slowly and carefully, he gave to both Lys and Diaspar the knowledge that had been won from the mind of Vanamonde. It was not even true that man had reached the stars. The whole of his little empire was bounded by the orbits of Pluto and Persephone. For interstellar space proved a barrier beyond his power to cross. His entire civilization was huddled around the sun and was still very young when the stars reached him. The impact must have been shattering. Despite his failures, man had never doubted that one day he would conquer the depths of space. He believed, too, that if the universe held his equals, it did not hold his superiors. Now he knew that both beliefs were wrong, and that for out among the stars were minds far greater than his own. For many centuries, first in the ships of other races, and later in machines built with borrowed knowledge, man had explored the galaxy. Everywhere he found cultures he could understand, but could not match. And here and there, he encountered minds which would soon have passed altogether beyond his comprehension. The shock was tremendous, but it proved the making of the race. Sadder and infinitely wiser, man had returned to the solar system to brood upon the knowledge he had gained. He would accept the challenge, and slowly, he evolved a plan which gave hope for the future. Once, the physical sciences had been man's greatest interest. Now, he turned even more fiercely to genetics and the study of the mind. Whatever the cost, he would drive himself to the limits of his evolution. The great experiment had consumed the entire energies of the race for millions of years. All that striving, all that sacrifice and toil, became only a handful of words in Calatrax's narrative. It had brought man his greatest victories. He had banished disease, he could live forever if he wished, and in mastering telepathy, he had bent the most subtle of all powers to his will. He was ready to go out again, relying upon his own resources, into the great spaces of the galaxy. He would meet, as an equal, the races of the worlds from which he had once turned aside, and he would play his full part in the story of the universe. These things he did. From this age, perhaps the most spacious of all history, came the legends of the Empire. It had been an empire of many races, but this had been forgotten in the drama, too tremendous for tragedy, in which it had come to its end. The Empire had lasted for at least 1,000,000 years. It must have known many crises, perhaps even wars. But all these were lost in the sweep of great races moving together toward maturity. "We can be proud," continued Calatrax, "of the part our ancestors played in this story. Even when they had reached their cultural plateau, they lost none of their initiative. We deal now with conjecture rather than proved fact, but it seems certain that the experiments which were at once the Empire's downfall and its crowning glory were inspired and directed by man. The philosophy underlying these experiments appears to have been this: contact with other species had shown man how profoundly a race's world picture depended upon its physical body and the sense organs with which it was equipped. It was argued that a true picture of the universe could be attained, if at all, only by a mind that was free from such physical limitations, a pure mentality, in fact. This was a conception among many of Earth's ancient religious faiths, and it seemed strange that an idea which had no rational origin should finally become one of the greatest goals of science. No disembodied intelligence had ever been encountered in the natural universe. the Empire set out to create one. We have forgotten, with so much else, the skills and knowledge that made this possible. The scientists of the Empire had mastered all the forces of nature, all the secrets of time and space, as our minds are the byproduct of an immensely intricate arrangement of brain cells linked together by the network of the nervous system. So they strove to create a brain whose components were not material, but patterns embossed upon space itself. Such a brain, if one can call it that, would use electrical or yet higher forces for its operation, and would be completely free from the tyranny of matter. It could function with far greater speed than any organic intelligence. It could endure as long as there was an erg of free energy left in the universe, and no limit could be seen for its powers. Once created, it would develop potentialities which even its makers could not foresee. Largely, as a result of the experience gained in his own regeneration, man suggested that the creation of such beings should be attempted. It was the greatest challenge ever thrown out to intelligence in the universe, and after centuries of debate, it was accepted. All the races of the galaxy joined together in its fulfillment. More than 1,000,000 years were to separate the dream from the reality. Civilizations were to rise and fall, again and yet again. The age-long toil of worlds was to be lost, but the goal was never forgotten. One day, we may know the full story of this, the greatest sustained effort in all history. Today, we only know that its ending was a disaster that almost wrecked the galaxy. Into this period, Vanamonde's mind refuses to go. There is a narrow region of time which is blocked to him, but only, we believe, by his own fears. At its beginning, we can see the Empire at the summit of its glory, taut with the expectation of coming successes. At its end, only a few thousand years later, the Empire is shattered, and the stars themselves are dimmed as though drained of their power. Over the galaxy hangs a pall of fear, a fear which is linked to the name, the Mad Mind. What must have happened in that short period is not hard to guess. The pure mentality had been created, but it was either insane, or as seems more likely from other sources, was implacably hostile to matter. For centuries it ravaged the universe, until brought under control by forces at which we cannot guess. Whatever weapon the Empire used in its extremity squandered the resources of the stars. From the memories of that conflict spring some, though not all, of the legends of the invaders. But of this I shall presently say no more. The Mad Mind could not be destroyed, for it was immortal. It was driven to the edge of the galaxy, and there, imprisoned in a way we do not understand. Its prison was a strange artificial star known as the Black Sun, and there it remains to this day. When the Black Sun dies, it will be free again. How far in the future that day lies, there is no way of telling. Calatrax became silent, as if lost in his own thoughts, utterly unconscious of the fact that the eyes of all the world were upon him. In the long silence, Alvin glanced over the packed multitude around him, seeking to read their minds as they faced their revelation, and this unknown threat, which must now replace the myth of the invaders. For the most part, the faces of his fellow citizens were frozen in disbelief. They were still struggling to reject their false past, and could not yet accept the yet stranger reality that had superseded it. Calatrax began to speak again in a quiet, more subdued voice as he described the last days of the Empire. This was the age, Alvin realized as the picture unfolded before him, in which he would have liked to have lived. There had been adventure then, and a superb and dauntless courage, the courage that could snatch victory from the teeth of disaster. Though the galaxy had been laid waste by the Mad Mind, the resources of the Empire were still numerous, and its spirit was unbroken. With a courage at which we can only marvel, the great experiment was resumed, and a search made for the flaw that had caused the catastrophe. There was now, of course, many who opposed the work and predicted further disasters, but they were overruled. The project went ahead and, with the knowledge so bitterly gained, this time it succeeded. The new race that was born had a potential intellect that could not even be measured, but it was completely infantile. We do not know if this was expected by its creators, but it seems likely that they knew it to be inevitable. Millions of years would be needed before it could reach maturity, and nothing could be done to hasten the process. Vanamonde was the first of these minds. There must be others elsewhere in the galaxy, but we believe that only a very few were created, for Vanamonde has never encountered any of his fellows. The creation of the pure mentalities was the greatest achievement of galactic civilization. In it, man played a major, and perhaps a dominant part. I have made no reference to Earth itself, for its story is merely a tiny thread in an enormous tapestry. Since it had always been drained of its most adventurous spirits, our planet had inevitably become highly conservative, and in the end, it opposed the scientists who created Vanamonde. Certainly, it played no part at all in the final act. The work of the Empire was now finished. The men of that age looked around at the stars they had ravaged in their desperate peril, and they made their decision. They would leave the universe to Vanamonde. There is a mystery here, a mystery we may never solve, for Vanamonde cannot help us. All we know is that the Empire made contact with something very strange and very great, far away around the curve of the cosmos, at the other extremity of space itself. What it was, we can only guess, but its call must have been of immense urgency and immense promise. Within a very short period of time, our ancestors and their fellow races have gone upon a journey which we cannot follow. Vanamonde's thoughts seem to be bounded by the confines of the galaxy, but through his mind, we have watched the beginnings of this great and mysterious adventure. Here is the image that we have reconstructed. Now you are going to look more than 1 billion years into the past. A pale wraith of its former glory, the slowly turning wheel of the galaxy hung in nothingness. Throughout its length were the great empty rents which the madmind had torn, wounds that in ages to come the drifting stars would fill. But they would never replace the splendor that had gone. Man was about to leave his universe, as long ago he had left his world. And not only man, but the 1,000 other races that had worked with him to make the Empire. They had gathered together, here at the edge of the galaxy, with its whole thickness between them and the goal they would not reach for ages. They had assembled a fleet before which imagination quailed. Its flagships were suns, its smallest vessels, planets. An entire globular cluster, with all its solar systems and all their teeming worlds, was about to be launched across infinity. The long line of fire smashed through the heart of the universe, leaping from star to star. In a moment of time, 1,000 suns had died, feeding their energies to the monstrous shape that had torn along the axis of the galaxy, and was now receding into the abyss. So the Empire left our universe, to meet its destiny elsewhere. When its heirs, the pure mentalities, have reached their full stature, it may return again. But that day must still lie far ahead. This, in its briefest and most superficial outlines, is the story of galactic civilization. Our own history, which to us seems so important, is no more than a belated and trivial epilogue, though one so complex that we have not yet been able to unravel all its details. It seems that many of the older, less adventurous races refused to leave their homes. Our direct ancestors were among them. Most of those races fell into decadence and are now extinct, though some may still survive. Our own world barely escaped the same fate. During the transition centuries, which actually lasted for millions of years, the knowledge of the past was lost, or else deliberately destroyed. The latter, though hard it is to believe, seems more probable. For ages, man sank into a superstitious, yet still scientific barbarism during which he distorted history to remove his sense of impotence and failure. The legends of the invaders are completely false, although the desperate struggle against the mad mind undoubtedly contributed something to them. Nothing drove our ancestors back to Earth, except the sickness in their souls. When we made this discovery, one problem in particular puzzled us in Lys. The Battle of Shalmoraine never occurred, yet Shalmoraine existed, and exists to this day. What is more, it was one of the greatest weapons of destruction ever built. It took us some time to resolve this puzzle, but the answer, once it was found, was very simple. Long ago, our Earth had a single giant satellite, the Moon. When, in the tug-of-war between the tides and gravity, the Moon at last began to fall, it became necessary to destroy it. Shalmoraine was built for that purpose, and around its use were woven the legends you all know. Calatrax smiled a little ruefully at his immense audience. There are many other legends, partly true and partly false, and other paradoxes in our past which have not yet been resolved. That problem, though, is one for the psychologist rather than the historian. Even the records of the central computer cannot be wholly trusted, and bear clear evidence of tampering in the very remote past. On Earth, only Diaspar and Lys survived the period of decadence. Diaspar, thanks to the perfection of its machines. Lys, owing to its partial isolation and the unusual intellectual powers of its people. But both cultures, even when they had struggled back to their former level, were distorted by the fears and myths they had inherited. These fears need haunt us no longer. It is not my duty as a historian to predict the future, only to observe and interpret the past. But its lesson is clear enough. We have lived too long out of contact with reality, and now the time has come to rebuild our lives.